The AI optimism in the world is rising, but it's rising very slowly because, as per the AI Index Report 2025 published by the Stanford University, only 55% of the world now is optimistic about AI products and services, meaning that they think that the AI will do more good in the world than the harm, which, by the way, was 52% in 2022. So this perception is changing very slowly because the world is becoming, as per the report, cautiously optimistic. Now, that's because there's always a huge bubble around how much one knows about any topic, and based on what they know, they try to make some broad assumptions. And those assumptions sometimes can be really far from the actual truth because they are often one-dimensional, or they may overlook adjacent or contradictory data or the broader context, which then paints a very skewed view of how things are or where things might go. So when you choose a field like artificial intelligence, where the technology itself is developing at such a rapid pace that it will most likely accelerate every facet of our lives in the next 2 to 5 years, but also beyond that and most likely forever, then it's important that we learn about it as much as we can. It's important that we do not make false or unhealthy assumptions. It's also important that we keep a very flexible, open, pragmatic, rational outlook towards this transformative technology. And that's what this video is about. It's about AI literacy. Now, what's AI literacy? The way UNESCO defines it, it's the set of skills and knowledge that enables individuals to understand, use, evaluate, and critically engage with artificial intelligence technologies, including their applications, limitations, and societal implications. So you can see that this is not a one-dimensional thing, like simply just learning how to use the Gen AI tools, whether it's in your day-to-day life or in your workflows, or some other narrow versions of it. It's much more than that. And I want to take the liberty to redefine the scope of it because I'm looking at a much bigger picture and I don't quite know what the appropriate phrasing for it might be other than AI literacy, because the way I'm looking at it, it's about everything that intersects with it. It's a combination of, some understanding of various skill sets, but also a general awareness or some knowledge of things like global policies, regulations, geopolitics, things like philosophy, art, and everything beyond. And of course, not everyone can or will know everything. There will be various degrees of understanding and competence. But the idea is to see the emerging world through this new lens and then try to stay agile in the face of it. So that makes me wonder where we are today as individuals and as a society overall, and how different types of people look at this relatively new technology. And I think you could paint that picture by considering how much one knows about the technology and what their attitude towards it is like. So what I mean is this: if you were to plot these two things on a graph, it would look something like this. So on this chart, the further right someone is, the more knowledge they have about AI, and the further up they are, the more positive their outlook is towards AI. So of course, the further left or down someone is, the more ignorant or negative their outlook is. So this sort of a graph would then result in some versions of 4 different types of personas, so to speak. Now, before I dive deeper, keep in mind that these are extreme versions and most people are not exactly like this. There are some versions of it and they may be placed in different positions on the quadrant, but if you were to assign scores, a small fraction may even be placed in 2 or more quadrants at the same time, because both these parameters are sort of transient in nature. But if you were to just look at this, what we have is that on the bottom left, you have fearful skeptics. Now, this section represents people who may feel like they're outsiders. They have very little to sort of no understanding of the technology, and they sort of carry a lot of misconceptions, and their attitude is often fear-based. It may come from stories, it may come from, dystopian sci-fi novels and movies, or some other fictional and unreliable sources, and they may have the tendencies to extrapolate their little understanding into something undesirable and fearing. And in general, their negative attitude towards the technology may stem from lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in governments, media, regulations, in other nations. And they may be prone to only look at the downsides of the technology, which I would argue is not a healthy way to look at it because it undermines the upsides, and we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, these are the kinds of people that feel like with the advancement of technology, something is being done to them, not for them, and certainly not with them. And I feel like a large portion of the society actually falls within this quadrant. I mean, there are several industry reports that highlight that there is a trust deficit among people, meaning that they are more concerned than excited about this new wave. Because here's the truth: unless someone is a knowledge worker of some sort or a student, their interaction with a lot of Gen AI tools may be very, very limited. And it may be limited to just the interactions in some sort of a forced setting, like when they need to interact with a customer support chatbot or when they need to place an order or something like that. Because the chances that a daily wage worker is using ChatGPT to solve problems or use it for ideation in his day-to-day work is pretty low at the moment. And if you go around asking people on the street how much they understand about AI or Gen AI or what they think about it, I'm sure you would not be surprised to see that most people have a very limited understanding right now. Even though, predictive AI has been part of the society for a very long time, we all see forecasts and predictions everywhere all the time. But the problem is that because people have a very limited understanding, they also hold a lot of negative thoughts around it, because there's a huge correlation between those two things. The less knowledge we have, the more gaps we fill up in our minds, and a lot of those thoughts can be negative in nature. That's because humans are also by default risk averse. That's not a bug of our human psychology. It's a feature. It keeps us safe, but it's not as useful in today's world as say it was thousands of years ago when we were hunting. But now let's say someone who does have a positive attitude towards this technology. Well, in that case, they may not be fearful about technology, but they also may not understand it because it doesn't directly intersect with their world in a meaningful way just yet. So maybe at the extreme end of this would be someone who loves the idea of AI, but also may have misconceptions or a very surface level understanding of it. They may be skimming it, or they may be getting caught up in the hype without actually understanding it. They may be getting swayed by the marketing campaigns or the bold promises, but overall they can be classified as the promoters of the technology and maybe adopters as well, because they're not pessimistic and they're not driven by the fear of it, but at least they're not detractors. And honestly, I see a very small fraction of the society being a part of this bucket, because these may be the people who are savvy users of other kinds of tech, but they just haven't had the time to upgrade their knowledge with respect to AI. Because I often get a chance to talk to some of the leaders or senior people of some big companies, and I understand that they're trying to modernize their tech stack, they're trying to keep up with the AI race, but they absolutely have no idea where to start from. They don't even know the basic fundamentals, and they don't even have the time to learn something new from scratch. They just have very busy lives and they only have so much time and energy to learn something new. So those are some of the kind of people that I can think of falling in this bracket. And that's not a bad thing, because everyone has a circle of competence. So just because someone is brilliant in one domain doesn't mean that they're competent in other areas as well. And that certainly applies to artificial intelligence. But let's say now we have someone who is quite the opposite. Let's say they know a lot about AI, they know about the technology, they know about its applications, they know the economics, the politics, and everything else in between and around it. But because of their own personal experiences and their outlook towards it, they also may have very low trust in the way it's being regulated. They may think that the downsides outweigh the upsides. In other words, they're skeptics, but they're informed skeptics. And they're fearful, but they're making highly educated and grounded claims. They're sort of detractors, but their arguments are often based on a deeper understanding of the landscape. And they're advocating for more audits, more regulations, slower rollouts, some sort of kill switches. And they're probably the loudest policy voices out there, and they want to make the AI companies, the government, institutions, all of those entities accountable for every action. So they're looking at everything that can and will start to fall apart if we are not, ready with the way things are advancing right now. And I personally do think that they deserve a special place right now in this AI landscape and these sorts of discussions, because their voices are equally important. And it's not because I think that they are right 100%. It's because I think there needs to be strong voices to sort of balance the dynamics a little, and also just to keep the blind advocates in check, to balance the power a little bit. Because quite frankly, even the people at the very top levels, the CEOs, don't know how these technologies will evolve and shape the future of humanity, and they openly accept it. But they're all caught up in some sort of a race, and because they're trying to outcompete other companies, they look at the technology purely from the POV of innovation. They look at it from the point of view of scale, economic incentives, and it's not just a random approach. They are just acting in alignment with the incentives that they face. And all that is great, but there also needs to be an equally strong, if not stronger, voice to sort of balance some of that recklessness that you see. Because the further up and right you go, the more informed and optimistic you become, which is essential in taking the technology forward, but at the same time, it lacks a healthy dosage of skepticism, because at no point you will have enough insight or control over things that can actually go wrong. Because, in risk analysis, there's something called unknown unknowns, which means that you cannot know everything, but also often you don't know what you don't know. You don't know that there is a gap in your knowledge, so you don't explore it. You only gain that knowledge in hindsight. There's something called this Rumsfeld paradox that states that we are often blindsided not by what we know is risky, but by what we don't even realize we are missing. And in the case of AI, I think those blind spots multiply quite fast. So with more dynamic situations, it's really important to take that sort of thinking into account. So that's in rough sense how different sections of the society may look at this technology. But like I said, it's not a fixed thing. It's a sort of a sliding scale. How positive and how much understanding we are talking about is sort of relative. But the big question may be to understand how different people end up in each of these quadrants or places. Like, what are those top drivers that push them in one of these quadrants? And I think to understand that, we just need to understand that there is no sort of straightforward answer for this, because you may need to peel, various layers of sociology, history, psychology, and multiple other domains. And even then, the explanation can be very limiting, because these things can be very subjective. Two people born in the same city and at the same time, even in the same household, can end up in very different situations and places. So there is no simple explanation. But broadly speaking, in a much simplistic way, we can look at three things that contribute significantly towards these outcomes. The first of which is context. It's the way in which they may receive some sort of information. It may be their several touch points, either directly in a primary fashion where they interact with the technology, or in the secondary form through a piece of content or a story or some sort of a narrative. In other words, context is about how the technology makes its first impression into their lives. So take an example of a fearful skeptic. What are some of the ways they became fearful and skeptical about this technology in the first place? I think it's not pretty hard to imagine that it could have been very early on in their lives, maybe through watching, dystopian movies or reading books that highlight the dramatic stories about the world ending due to a transformational technology that goes out of control. And one thing I would like to say about fiction is that it's boring to make fiction where everything goes well, because at its very core, fictional stories need conflict and a resolution. So by design, the fictional stories tend to be more negative. They are designed with really high and often unimaginable stakes in them, because their primary purpose is to entertain you. So if your outlook is influenced by fiction, then at least what you could do is to be aware of that. Be aware that the fiction is meant for entertainment. It's not meant for enlightenment. But anyway, coming back to the original point, a lot of skepticism and fear may also come from things like the news, which, by the way, can also border on entertainment and drama, where you see things in the negative light mostly. Or it could come from things like interacting with premature tech, that may seem a bit more intrusive or inadequate in a lot of ways. Like, a robo-advisor or a chatbot that cannot understand sentiments or context. It could come from social narratives about things like job replacements or rise in fraud cases. And while those are real challenges, there are ways to deal with them. To think that a complex system will not have some downsides to it is not the right approach. But then to only think in those terms and only focus on the negatives can lead to a very dramatic and unrealistic and largely false understanding of the technology. And I think similarly, in other personas, they may have their own versions and backstories. The informed skeptics may be reading too many papers on how biases can lead to the downfall of the society, or how the containment problem is impossible to solve with the current set of regulations, or how there are already early signs of super intelligence that will wipe out all the humans and replace them with paper clips. Or the enthusiasts may only be looking at the future of abundance, because they're sort of tracking the rate of progress in the last 100 years, and they sort of firmly believe that this is going to make the world a better and more abundant place. And they wouldn't hesitate handing their credit card info into the very, very early signs of AI agents. So In all of this, you can see that there is a heavy reliance on the context within which people gather their information and form their viewpoints. But that's not all of it, because depending on what the context is, these personas interpret the capabilities as well. And it could be the capability of the technology itself, but also of the institutions, of different individuals, of the societies at large. And based on those capabilities, then they try to estimate what the consequences may look like. And based on the versions and the severity of the consequences, they may form some sort of a narrative. So to give you an example, a bad narrative could look like, I don't get the tech, it sounds powerful and beyond my comprehension, and I can't deal with it, so it's dangerous, so I don't want any part of it in my life. And this sort of a bad narrative form, because humans are not logic machines. We are storytelling creatures. I think Yuval Noah Harari put it the best when he said, we think in stories, not statistics. So essentially, it's the story you tell yourself about AI and technology that determines your attitude towards it. You could tell yourself that I understand how it works on some level. I can see that it can be a great tool for humanity, but there are certain limitations to its adoption. And if it's executed properly, it could actually result in a much better future. So let's put guardrails wherever necessary. Let's stay cautious, optimistic, but let's also adopt it to better our lives, because whether we want it or not, we are headed in that direction anyway. Now, the good and the bad news is that the personal narratives do change based on personal experiences and knowledge, but then it does not happen overnight. So what's the solution? How can someone who is stuck in one quadrant change their views and move across a different quadrant? So what is that ladder of progress in this AI literacy looks like, and where can those steps in the ladder come from? I think there's a very simplified 3-step way to look at it. It starts with first being ready to expose yourself to different ideas and concepts. It starts with expanding the breadth of your knowledge. It starts with opening yourself up to the ideas and support your understanding, to reward yourself, to look for more proof points, but also to allow yourself to be okay to learn the counter arguments without getting caught up in the confirmation bias. It's kind of like the Bayesian updating. You have to let go of your old beliefs as new information arrives, and you don't have to cling on to outdated narratives. And these could look like anything. These could look like the areas like the history of AI, or the geopolitical aspect of it, or the current supply chain issues when it comes to GPUs, or the regulations that impact the development and adoption of AI, or some of the philosophical challenges that are out there that threaten us. And I think the best part of it is the educational element of this technology. I mean, the aspect where you can feed your own doubts to the technology and get the answer from it, and then probe it as many ways as possible until you feel like you have understood everything. Because once the breadth is achieved, it's also about the depth of your knowledge. And here you can be selective. You could choose to learn all about deep learning, or you could get deep into the politics or the policies or the business applications or domain specific use cases. The list is endless, right? So, but again, if you go in depth, the horizontal learning does not stop. I mean, it's just that each step gets more firm, more cemented, more obvious, more contextual. And that is the third step on the ladder of engagement. This is when you can start engaging with the concepts and tools. It's when you start seeing how it can be implemented in real life and scenarios. It could, start as small as integrating tools in your lives responsibly, or it could start as taking up more AI focused role in your next job, or it could, come from talking to the subject matter experts in this area. And before I close this video, just keep in mind that there's a lot of misinformation and speculation on the internet about this technology. And that's because not everyone knows what's going on. And part of that is because the underlying technology itself is changing very rapidly. So there's a lot happening on a daily basis. There are a lot of global announcements that happen every day, and it's impossible for an average person to consume or understand all of that. So do your due diligence, only consume things that are trustworthy, but also question everything anyone says, including the content in this video, and then form your opinions. It's quite like what Descartes did when he started philosophy. He started by doubting everything, and that kind of approach isn't cynicism, it's just a foundation for some sort of clarity. Because the idea is to have more of a holistic and true understanding of this, I would say, wonderful technology, but then we also need to navigate the whole hype and hysteria around it. So a little bit of sort of epistemic humility, if you will, is really needed in this case.